All right, so thank you, Matt, for that very kind introduction. You kind of already covered this, but I just wanted to share a bit about my broader interests. So I've worked on a lot of projects related to issues like how embodiment affects generalization, what symbols are. I'm working on a memory project right now that I'm pretty excited about and hope to have out in a few weeks on arXiv. But today I'm going to tell you about this transfer project that I worked on during my PhD and published a few months ago. So this is an outline of the talk. I'm going to start off with an introduction where I go through sort of the high-level ideas of how this project works. I'm going to tell you a bit about the implementation, sort of more details of the architecture and training. I'll walk through a few case studies of applying this idea to a few different domains, talk about some other perspectives one could have on the issue and how they relate to this work, and then give some concluding thoughts. Okay. So I'd like to start with the observation that humans can adapt to a new task on our first try. So if you're sitting around with your friends playing poker and your friend says, all right, next round, let's try to lose. The winner will be the person who loses the next round. You'll be able to adapt to this on your first try and do pretty well, even though it contradicts everything you've been trying to do before. Or if you're out bird watching and someone says, I'm looking for a bird like this one, except colored red. You'll be able to recognize that bird on your first try. And by contrast to this human flexibility, it's frequently suggested that deep learning can be inflexible. So I've just highlighted a sampling of statements along these lines from various articles, both academic articles and news articles on the subject. And so the question that I wanted to address in this project is, how could our deep learning models reuse their knowledge flexibly without needing to be entirely retrained for a new task? And the perspective I'm going to take is that we can see adaptation as a form of task transformation, or task transformation as a form of adaptation. So when your friend says, next round, let's try to lose at poker, what I suggest is that you have in mind a representation of the task you're currently trying to perform, the task of winning at poker. And you know something about the relationship between winning and losing, maybe within poker or maybe across other games as well. And my idea is that you can basically combine these two things, the current task and the relationship between winning and losing across different tasks, in order to adapt your task representation, in order to try to switch to losing at poker. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that this task transformation idea can provide a useful perspective on adaptation. And my goal in this talk is going to be to outline a deep learning framework that can transform task representations in order to adapt to new tasks. So in order to get there, we're going to have to think about what tasks are. And I'm going to take a fairly standard deep learning starting point, which is to view tasks as functions or mappings. Mappings from inputs to outputs. So you can think of poker as, sorry, do you see these videos on the side of the screen? Are they blocking your view of the slides? No, okay. Just to get them out of my way. So you can think of tasks as functions from inputs to outputs. So for example, you can think of poker as a mapping from hands to bets. You get a hand. If it's a good hand, you want to bet a lot of money on it. If it's a bad hand, you don't. You can think of chess as a mapping of chess positions to moves. You can think of sort of vision, at least a very simple kind of vision, as a mapping from images to classifications. And you can think of question answering as a mapping from questions to answers. So this is a pretty standard deep learning perspective to view tasks as a function from inputs to outputs. And the standard deep learning approach is to infer task mapping from many examples. So we train a system on 1 million hands of poker, and then it's able to generalize to new hands. In particular, the idea is that if there's structure in the task, in the way that examples relate to each other, then the system deep learning will be able to generalize. So if you teach a system that in poker, this hand is pretty bad and it should bet 0, this hand is very good and it should bet a lot of money, this hand is okay and it should bet some money, then the system should be able to infer from these examples that it could generalize to saying, oh, this hand looks a lot like another hand that was good, and therefore I should probably bet a lot of money on it. So I'm going to take the perspective that tasks are mappings from inputs to outputs, and that these tasks can be generalized from examples. Okay, great. And now I want to think about how we can alter these tasks to adapt to variations. And so I'm going to view this alteration of the task as adapting the mappings. So when you transform this task of winning at poker to this task of losing at poker, what you're really doing is taking this mapping, this function from poker hands to bets, and turning it into a different mapping from hands of cards to bets. And in particular, you might be reversing sort of the values of the hands. So how can we adapt a mapping? Well, the basic idea of this work is to see adapting a mapping as a higher order problem. And we're going to frame adaptation in terms of metamappings, which are higher order functions that take a basic task mapping as input and output a transformed version of the task mapping. So we have this higher order function that takes the poker mapping and outputs the transformed version, the losing poker mapping. And the idea is going to be that metamappings capture systematic higher order relationships between tasks. The idea that there's something in common about the relationship between winning and losing in blackjack, in chess, and in poker. And that this is going to allow us to infer a general notion of losing that can be applied to new games. Because there's an analogous structure in the relationship between winning and losing across games. So ideally, we should be able to generalize metamappings from examples, just like we can generalize basic tasks like poker from examples. And therefore, we can use the standard tools of deep learning to implement these higher order functions, as long as we can figure out a way to represent the tasks for input and output to these higher order mappings. So I'm going to view transforming the task mapping as a way of adapting. And I'm going to do this by metamappings, which are higher order mappings that transform the basic task mappings. Okay, so let me pause there and ask if there are any questions about these sort of high-level motivations before I dive into how this all actually works. Looks like Josh has a question.
Yeah, if it's okay. So I hope this isn't too naive, but I'm wondering, how do you, it seems that there are activities that are sort of closer together where the metamapping would be, would likely work better. You know, I mean, not to be cliched, but you know, I've heard people say, like, when you play poker, you're playing your opponents, not you're playing your hand. And that seems like something that's not necessarily, you know, in poker, the sequence of bets, the aggressiveness that you escalate your bets, like those all seem like really relevant inputs, maybe even more so than what your hand is. Whereas like in chess, if you're down to 3 pawns and a king and your opponent has 2 rooks and 2 bishops and a queen, you're probably not going to win, right? No matter how good you are at bluffing. So, you know, maybe I'm jumping the gun, but is this something, is there a way of creating a mapping of tasks to sort of evaluate how proximal they are within a certain metamap, versus when you go too far afield and you sort of say, yeah, it works from task A to task B, but task A to task C is too big a jump?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't looked at things like that in detail because the tasks I've been working with are mostly pretty simple. So I do work with some card game-like tasks, but they're sort of simplified from the real complexity of actually playing poker with people, where you sort of have to adapt to their personalities and betting styles and how often they bluff and so on. So it would be very interesting to look at that. I mean, I have like in some of my task domains, I have tasks of varying complexity, and there is some evidence. I don't have any slides on this in the talk, but I will tell you a bit about this sort of like domain of mathematical objects I have, and the metamappings do work slightly better with the simpler mathematical objects than with the more complex ones. I mean, they still work pretty well with more complex ones, but not quite as well as they do with the simplest ones. So yeah, it's definitely true that like as the sort of thing you're trying to adapt gets more complex and maybe more dynamic, then it's harder to adapt it, and you might need sort of more evidence or more experience to do that well. Yeah, good question. Was there another question?
Yeah, I think John Hummel has a question as well. John, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe you'll get to this, but you observe that this happens when, because there's an analogous structure between these tasks.
Right.
Well, arguably, the recognition that there exists an analogous structure between these tasks is the whole game. Yep. Are you going to do that for the network, or is it going to do it on its own?
Right. So let me get back to that at the end. In short, I'm going to be like giving the network a lot of privileged information about where it should be looking for analogies, but it has to find the analogous structure on its own. So I'm going to be telling it like there's relationships between these tasks that are like parallel, but it has to figure out exactly what those analogies are on its own. Yeah, let me get back to that after I've described how the architecture actually works, and we'll see if it answers your question. Cool. So just to give you a preview of the architecture, what I'm going to implement is an architecture that performs basic task mappings by learning a vector representation for each task. So it's going to learn a set of 512 real numbers or so that capture the structure of that task in combination with the rest of the architecture. And you could imagine this being sort of very loosely like the kind of representation of a task one might have distributed across neurons in a brain, very, very loosely. And then the system is going to learn to transform those task representation vectors in order to perform metamappings. So now that we have vector representations for tasks, vectors are things that we know how to work well with in deep learning, and so we can transform those in order to adapt. And again, this is going to allow the system to perform new tasks without having examples of those tasks based on the relationship to prior tasks. Okay, so what does performing a task look like in my architecture? Well, it looks something like this. Imagine that you get a hand of poker cards. You're first going to pass that hand through some sort of perception network, which is going to encode the features of those cards into some representation of the hand. And then you're going to pass that representation through a task network, which is going to decide whether that's a good hand or a bad hand, produce a representation for a bet, and then decode that representation to produce the actual action of betting. And the interesting part of this architecture is going to be in the task network, which I'm going to have adapt to the different tasks that it needs to perform, like poker or blackjack or whatever. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to have a representation of the task, which I'm going to pass through a hypernetwork, and it will actually set the weights of this task network. So the way this is going to work is that there's some default weights to the task network, which you can think of as sort of being like default patterns of what's good or bad. And the hypernetwork is actually going to alter those weights by adding to them, adding to both the weights and biases of this network. So I'm going to use the task representation to set the weights of the task network, to alter the weights of the task network to allow it to perform the current task. And the idea is that if you put in a poker representation, you should get a task network that does poker. If you put in a blackjack representation, you should get a task network that does blackjack. So that's how my model is going to perform different tasks. Okay, but where does the task representation come from? Well, I'm going to take the perspective of performing a task from examples, and in particular of performing a task from a relatively small set of examples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to encode the examples, like poker hands and how much they won or lost. And I'm going to take a set of these examples, various hands of poker and their winnings. I'm going to encode it with an example network that will aggregate across this data. And I'm going to aggregate across these data points to construct the task representation. So the idea is that the system, thinks about a few different hands of poker, whether they won or lost. And then from that, it figures out what the task of poker is like. And then with that task representation, it can adapt the task network to doing this task. And then it can go off and play some new hands of poker. And just to give you a sense of how this is trained, we can train this system end to end to do this task. So the basic idea there is that, well, we encode some example hands of poker, pass those through the example network to construct the task representation, pass that through the hypernetwork to set the weights of the task network to perform the task. Then we take in a new hand of poker, we construct a representation for that, we pass that through the task network, we construct a representation for the bet, we decode that to a bet, and then we are going to actually play that hand and see whether the system wins or loses. And then once we've done that, we can sort of calculate like an error, like whether the system made a good or bad choice, what we'd call a loss in machine learning. And then we can use that loss to update the weights of all the networks in the system, all the way back even to how these example hands are encoded. And so that's how I'm going to train the system. I saw someone raised a hand. John, would you like to ask a question now?
It's a simple clarification question, if I might.
Sure, yes.
What is the nature of the knowledge to which the hypernetwork has access?
I'm not sure if that's a simple question. The hypernetwork has access to task representation, which is constructed by a nonlinear aggregation of task examples, of nonlinearly processed task examples. So in principle, the hypernetwork could have access to almost anything that you could compute based on a set of examples of like poker hands and whether they won or lost, right? So
I guess my question is simpler. Is it simply knowledge of the input-output pairings, or does it have detailed knowledge of the synapses whereby other neurons are communicating with each other?
I see. So the only thing it gets explicit knowledge of is the input-output pairings. But you might think that in the process of training this model, the hypernetwork is going to sort of implicitly figure out which task network synapses it should adapt to do different kinds of tasks. Like the task network might specialize so that some regions should be set for sort of like paying attention to the suit of the cards. Some regions should be set for paying attention to the rank of the cards. Some regions should be set for, sort of looking for poker hands versus like blackjack features.
Okay.
And so
this is not simple. You can put me off, but that inference is decidedly ill-posed from the input-output pairings.
That is absolutely true. I mean, one observation is that, so I'm going to be training this system across relatively many different tasks. So it's not just going to be playing poker, right? It's going to be playing poker and blackjack and hearts and so on. But nevertheless, it's the case that the inference is still poorly posed. And there's different ways you could see that. One is that there's a lot of ways you could solve this problem. And so it's just not well specified what's the right one. But I guess like one observation to make is that empirically deep learning does pretty well with ill-posed inferences, I would say. So you can have radically over-parameterized networks. You can train them on a relatively small data set with appropriate loss functions and regularization, and they'll learn pretty well. And so I guess like one way you can look at this work is just empirically, I'm going to show you that this works. So, I mean, it's true that the inference is very complicated and ill-posed, but nevertheless, this works pretty well. And it's related to things that other people, this part of the project is related to things that other people have explored or are exploring right now. I just reviewed another paper that has an architecture a little bit like this. But yeah, it's a very interesting question. You know, what exactly does one of these networks know? And I'd love to talk about it further at the end. Okay, but for now, the model performs tasks by constructing a task representation from examples. And then the nice thing about that is that now we have a vector representation of tasks. And so now we have something that we can use to transform in order to adapt to new tasks. And that was really the point of all of this. So, okay, how is this going to work? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the representation of the task that we're currently performing. Let's say something like poker. I'm going to have this little wizard do some magic on it to get a representation of losing at poker. And the idea is that then I can put that representation of losing at poker into the hypernetwork to set the weights of the task network in order to perform that task. And so in this way, we'll be able to do the task of losing at poker without ever having any experience of that task based on its relationship to the task of winning at poker. Okay, so what is the magic ingredient in here? Well, it's going to look very similar to things you've seen before. I'm going to have some network that's going to do this adaptation from winning, the representation of winning to the representation of losing. And it's going to be based on a hypernetwork setting the weights of that network from a representation of the metamapping or the relationship that it's trying to capture. So you would put in a representation of a metamapping like trying to lose into a hypernetwork, set the weights of a task network in order to adapt your representation of poker to a representation of losing at poker, which then you can use to go off and perform the new task. Okay, and then where does this metamapping representation come from? Well, I'm going to construct it from examples, just like I did with the basic task representations. So the basic idea is that from examples of like winning at hearts and losing at hearts and winning at blackjack and losing at blackjack and so on, we'll collect a set of those examples, which here are going to actually be representations for those tasks, which are constructed by my model. Pass those to an example network, which will aggregate across them in some way in order to produce a metamapping representation. And then we can pass that into the hypernetwork, set the weights of the task network to adapt task representations from winning to losing. And that's the basic idea of how task transformation is going to work. Are there any questions here? Cool. So the model performs metamappings by constructing a metamapping representation from examples of that mapping. And if you'll notice, the way I described doing the basic tasks and the way I described doing the metamappings to you were pretty similar. And that's not a coincidence. So what I'd like to suggest is that there's actually an analogy across levels of abstraction between basic tasks and metamappings. They're both just functions from inputs to outputs that we're trying to generalize from examples. And so I'm using the same sort of tasks, the same sort of structure of my networks for performing the basic tasks and for performing the metamappings. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use exactly the same networks, exactly the same example network for aggregating examples, and exactly the same hypernetwork and default task network weights for both the basic tasks and the metamappings. And you can relate this idea to the sort of computational idea of homoiconicity, which is basically, well, maybe I'll go into details about that in the questions if people want, but you can also just see this as sort of an analogy across levels of abstraction. My claim is that this will actually be beneficial in some places, in some cases, to the learning of the network. Possibly from John's perspective, because it helps the network sort of get a more well-posed problem, just having more sort of constraints on what these networks are required to do. Okay, so my claim is that we can exploit the functional analogy between basic tasks and metamappings by using exactly the same networks for both. All right, so let me sum up the way this method works, and then I can get to telling you about some actual experiments. So we're going to see basic tasks as mappings from inputs to outputs, for example, from poker hands to bets, which we can infer from examples. And we can perform these tasks by setting the weights of a task network conditioned on a representation of that task. We can implement one type of flexibility by transforming these task representations, for example, to switch from winning to losing. We can see this as a metamapping, a higher order function, which transforms task representations. And metamappings can be parsimoniously inferred and implemented using exactly the same networks as we use for the basic tasks. All right, one more pause for questions, and then I'll get to the experiments. Cool. All right, so I'll tell you about a few of the experiments that I've done with this. I'm going to first start with this poker setting because switching to losing is actually a pretty challenging task for current deep learning models. They're very bad at adapting to tasks where they have to do the opposite of everything they've been trying to do before. So we're going to try to put a model in a setting where it knows how to play poker, and we're asking it to switch to losing at poker. Okay, and the task setup. What we're going to do is I constructed 5 2-card games, which you can think of as very simplified versions of blackjack, poker, and sort of other kind of related games. And I created winning and losing variations of each one. In total, the system is going to be trained how to play 36 card games, and I'm going to hold out 4 losing variations of poker, all the losing variations of poker. What we're going to ask is, can the model, if it's trained on these games in the green region, and it's trained to adapt from winning to losing by metamapping on these games besides poker, like blackjack, will it be able to generalize that mapping to adapt from winning to losing at poker? Okay, and I'm going to show you the results on a plot that will look something like this. So on the left side, I'm going to show performance when the model is trying to win at poker. Hopefully it should be pretty good at that because it's been trained to do that. And on the right side, I'll show performance on the losing phase of poker. And there's a few possibilities of what that performance could look like. If the system adapted perfectly, its performance should be optimal at losing, and it would look sort of like this green curve. If the system gets confused and sort of just starts doing things randomly, its performance will drop down to chance, 0 on this sort of normalized plot. And if the system doesn't adapt its task representation at all, its performance will be well below chance. And that's sort of why I'm saying that these these kind of adaptation problems are hard for deep learning systems, because not adapting is very bad. Okay. And in fact, the system is not adapting optimally, but it's doing pretty well. It's getting somewhere around 85% performance on average, and higher than that on most of the runs, higher median performance than that. Cool. So metamapping can work. We can switch from winning to losing at poker based on a relatively small number of other game examples. So we trained it only to play 36 games. There's a relationship between, I guess, 32 of those. And based on those relationships, the system is able to generalize to adapt to losing at poker, which it has never done before. Great. So I want to tell you about a few more of the domains that I considered. This card game setting was very simplified, and there were only a few relationships that were possible between the tasks. So in the next domain I considered was mathematical objects, in particular polynomials in 4 variables of degree up to 2. So the idea here is that your basic tasks, a basic task might be like x squared plus 1, and they're mappings from 4 real inputs to 1 real output. So like if x is 0 and all the other variables are 0, then x squared plus 1 is just 1. If x is minus 1 and the other variables are whatever, then x squared plus 1 is 2, and so on. Or you might have a polynomial like this. And the nice thing about these mathematical objects is they have a lot of complex relationships among them. For example, I can have metamappings like multiply by 3, which maps x squared plus 1 to 3x squared plus 3, and 3w plus yz to 9w plus 3yz. Or I can have metamappings which permute the variables. So for example, this permutation would switch x squared plus 1 to z squared plus 1, and 3w plus yz to 3w plus xy. And so these tasks have much more interesting and rich structure among them that yields much more complex relationships. So to set up the space of tasks, I trained the system on a variety of metamappings, adding a constant to polynomials, multiplying by a constant, squaring them, and permuting the variables. And I trained it on around 2,200 basic polynomials in order to support all these mappings. We can come back to that large number later if you want. So what I'm going to show you is that the system is able to adapt very well to all of these tasks. This is just an average across all the different types of mappings, but in fact, if you break it down by mappings, it's doing pretty well at all of them, although more complex mappings like squaring are slightly harder than simpler ones like adding a constant. And the cool thing about this richer structure of the mathematical objects is that it actually makes different levels of generalization available. In particular, I'm going to show you that this model can generalize to held out metamappings. So what do I mean by that? Well, during training, I trained the system on things like permuting this permutation of the variables or multiplying by 3. And so when I evaluate, the plot I showed you before was evaluating that task, like multiplying by 3, on a polynomial it's never been applied to before, but evaluating a task that a metamapping that the system has never been that the system has been trained on throughout the course of training. However, because the system is constructing metamapping representations from examples, it should, in principle, be able to perform a metamapping based on a new relationship between tasks that's never seen before, as long as that metamapping is sufficiently, within the distribution of things it has seen before. And so, for example, I trained the system on metamappings corresponding to 12 of the possible permutations of variables, but I held out the other 12. And we can ask whether a system that's trained to perform some of these permutations is able to generalize to new permutations that it hasn't seen before. And I also held out some constants for addition and multiplication. So I trained -3 to 3, but I held out 2 and -2. And what I'm going to show you now is that the system can also adapt to these new metamappings that it's never seen before. And it can do so much better than not adapting at all. If you're wondering why this baseline is higher here than in the trained case, it's because of the slightly different distribution of tasks, in particular, the squaring metamapping, which I only trained. I don't have a held out version of that, tends to be very bad to not adapt in that setting. Okay, cool. So what I'd like to tell you is that not only can our system perform metamappings, but it can actually generalize to new metamappings, new relationships between tasks that's never seen before, based on examples of those metamappings. and in particular, examples of pairings of tasks that correspond to those metamappings. Right, so I should have maybe addressed this earlier when the architecture figure was up, but to come back to John's question from earlier, what I'm supervising, what information I'm giving this model is that like that it's trying to compute a relationship between tasks, transformation based on like pairings, like x squared plus 1, its representation of x squared plus 1, and its representation of 2x squared plus 2, and its representation of like 3y and its representation of 6y. So I give it a set of those examples, and then I give it a new task as input, and I ask it to produce a representation of the corresponding transform task, and I evaluate its performance with that representation to see how it does. So I am giving it the information about what the relationships between the tasks, or which tasks have the relationships, but it needs to figure out what those relationships are for itself. Sometimes they might be multiplying, sometimes they might be permuting the variables, sometimes they might be squaring, and so on. Yeah. Okay, so to maybe give you a little bit more intuition for how something like this works, I'm going to show you what how the representations of this system transform under a couple of the metamappings we considered. And in particular, what I'm showing you here is plots of the first two principal components of the model's task representation space when it's adapting to two different metamappings. So I'm going to show you for each task here, I'm going to plot an arrow where the beginning of the arrow is where that task representation is before adaptation, and the end of that arrow is where that task representation is after adaptation. So this is showing how these tasks transform under these metamappings. And the representation space of this model is organized such that the simpler tasks corresponding in particular to the constant polynomials or near constant ones are organized towards the outside of this sort of semicircular ring, which you can see in both plots, such that the more positive polynomials are towards the upper left of the ring, and the more negative polynomials are towards the lower right. And polynomials that involve more and more variables are clustered in more and more centrally, or both more variables and larger coefficients on those variables. So it's easiest to see what's happening with these task transformations by looking at this ring of constant polynomials. And what you'll see is that if we take this mapping, multiply by 3, what's happening is that the task representations are being pushed sort of outwards in both directions along this ring, right? The more positive polynomials are rotating and shifting and becoming even more positive, and the negative polynomials are rotating and shifting and becoming even more negative. And the more complicated polynomials that have multiple variables involved and so on are doing more complicated things in the middle. You can see some interesting structure in these. If you look at higher principal components as well, it's hard to really know what's going on though in just a few dimensions. So if we look at another metamapping like squaring, what we can see is that for the positive polynomials, the positive constant polynomials, it looks, kind of similar to multiplying by 3. The polynomials are again like getting more positive, rotating outward. But you can see for the negative polynomials, there's this massive sort of folding of the space where all the negative polynomials flip over to the positive side. Of course, that makes sense because we're squaring. So these plots are generated across all those 2200 polynomials I told you I trained the system on. Fewer in the squaring case because I didn't consider polynomials that when you squared that already had degree 2, because when you squared them, they'd have higher degree. But these mappings, the representations of the mappings that I used to generate these plots were only trained on 60 of these polynomials, and the rest of these it's generalizing to. And so you can see that you're getting relatively systematic transformations of these thousands of task representations based on only 60 examples. Are there any questions at this point? Cool. So the last task setting I'd like to tell you about, if I have time, which it looks like I do, right? Okay, perfect. Is this reinforcement learning setting, which I chose because both it has more complex features that make for more interesting tasks and much more complex adaptation. So I'm going to be working, instead of with a few real numbers or some simple encodings of cards, I'm going to be working with real pixel inputs to a reinforcement learning system. And the adaptation will be much more complicated than the settings I described to you, because the system actually has to adapt how it's behaving over time. And for those of you who are familiar with these RL ideas, this is going to be within a completely model-free system. So the task setup is going to have something in common with the card game setup. And basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create tasks where the agent is in a room. The agent is this little white triangle here. And there's always going to be 8 objects in the room that appear in 2 colors. One color is going to be a good color, and the other color is going to be a bad color. And there's going to be 5 pairs of such colors, like orange and green, or red and blue that you saw on the previous screen, that always appear together. And there's going to be 2 tasks that the agent can perform with these objects. One is to pick up the good objects, and the other is to push the good objects off the board. So, and whichever task the agent is trying to perform, it's always going to get +1 reward for interacting with a good object and -1 reward for interacting with a bad object. So if orange is the good color and the agent picks up an orange object, it'll get +1. If orange is the good color and the agent picks up a green object, it'll get -1. And the trick is that I'm going to hold out one color that's never good. So I'm going to make it so that during the course of the agent's training, the blue objects always give negative reward if it interacts with it. So the red objects are always good, the blue objects are always bad. Every other color, it switches back and forth, which one is good and which one is bad. And what I'm going to ask is, can the model adapt to choose to interact with this object, with this color that's always been negatively rewarded for interacting with, based on training on 18 tasks where it switches between these other colors, and based on this metamapping, which captures the switching structure, basically a metamapping that switches which color is good and which color is bad in a task. And what I find is, in fact, that the models are able to do this. They're able to do this well above chance, although certainly not perfectly. So that's cool. It's nice to see that metamapping can work even in some more complex settings. And then, yeah, so there's one other task domain that I'm not going to tell you about today, which has more complex features and sort of some conceptual structure. Basically, it's like recognizing visual concepts such as red triangles, blue circles, and so on. Okay, but what I would like to describe in the remaining time of the talk is some other perspectives you could have on adaptation and how they relate to these perspectives. And in particular, what I'd like to focus on is this idea that you could perform a task from language alone. So in my project, I've been telling you about performing tasks from examples of the tasks. That's where I get my task representations from. And then if you do this, in order to get a representation for a new task, you're going to, without having examples, you're going to have to transform a prior task representation somehow. However, you could imagine that we could just construct task representations from language alone, and this would sort of obviate the need for the whole thing. So, for example, if I tell one of you it's time to play poker, at least if you're familiar with poker, and you process that, you should be able to do the task of poker. And similarly, if I give this model an instruction like play poker, I process that through some sort of language processing network. I should be able to teach the model to construct a task representation from that, which is appropriate for playing poker. And you can imagine that if I give the model various pairings of like play poker, play blackjack but try to lose, play chess but try to lose, and so on, it could eventually figure out a general notion of what try to lose means from language that it could use to perform the task of losing at poker without ever having done that before. And so that's the perspective that I'm going to consider next. In particular, I'm going to test this out in the reinforcement learning settings because actually the sort of idea of like language conditioned reinforcement learning can work pretty well if you give it enough examples. I've done some prior work on this in the past. And I'm going to give the system some task descriptions that name the tasks, say which colors are involved, and tell the agent which color is good. So it's going to be something like pick up green, orange first, meaning it's the pickup task and the first color is good. And second means that it's the second color that's good. And what I'm going to test is, if I train the system with the exact same training setup that I trained my metamapping system with, will it be able to adapt to these tasks that it's never seen before based on the systematic language? But what I find is, in fact, that it doesn't adapt very well. There's too much sort of negative rewards of those objects to overcome for the language structure to cause the model to adapt. And so the model that's constructing task representations based on language alone is performing well below chance at this task. Okay, so systematic language alone doesn't always generalize well in challenging cases. And what I'd like to suggest is that it's because task relationships are the more fundamental thing that's systematic here. It's not really about the language. It's about the relationships between tasks that this language just incidentally captures. Okay, but I'd like to present one more perspective on this, which is this idea that we could metamap with language. So just like we can construct a task representation from language, we could also construct a metamapping representation from language and then use that to adapt our task representation, even if our task representation was constructed from language. And this provides another way that a model that constructs task representations from language could adapt to new tasks, a way of sort of combining both language and metamapping. And what I find is that metamapping from language performs nearly as well as metamapping from examples, maybe equally well. It's sort of hard to tell with the variance, but there is a significant difference in one of the tasks that I considered. And the observation I'd like to make here is that even in the case when language alone is not constructing good task representations, using those task representations together with metamapping can allow the system to adapt very well. So it seems like metamapping is a very useful idea in these domains where there's a challenging adaptation problem. John, you might also be interested in this sort of like language as a way of constructing task representations, because in some sense it provides a more constrained setting where maybe it's easier for the model to figure out what's going on. Although it still doesn't solve the problem of telling the network exactly what it should be doing. Okay, so metamapping can work well from either examples or from language, and it can do that in settings where language alone doesn't work well. All right, I'd like to quickly, actually, maybe I'll come back to that if anybody has questions about model-based methods and how they relate to this. But for now, I'll just wrap up. So in summary, models should be able to perform new tasks on their first try, which we call a zero shot in machine learning. And I'd like to suggest that it's useful to approach this by focusing on the systematic relationships between tasks, and suggest that the systematicity is fundamentally about these relationships and the analogies between them. And therefore, it's useful to transform task representations according to these relationships in order to perform a new task. These transformations can be seen as a higher order task or a metamapping. And these metamappings are actually analogous to basic tasks in the sense that both are just functions which can be generalized from examples. This metamapping perspective offers 80 to 90% zero-shot performance on new tasks, even ones that strongly contradict the training experience. And I've demonstrated this across a wide variety of task domains and computational paradigms. Now, to step back and reflect on some of the higher level ideas here, obviously I'm making some very strong assumptions here about the structure of the task space and what we know about that structure, what we can tell the model about that structure. And of course, in more realistic settings, it might not be the case that you have that kind of rich knowledge or supervision. And so the more general takeaways might be to think about relationships among tasks or other entities more broadly, and higher order computations or functions over functions more generally. I'd also like to suggest that from a more machine learning perspective, this meta learning idea that tasks are sort of like data points in their own right. The system learns from many tasks, and each task is sort of like one data piece that you're learning. I think kind of naturally leads to this idea of computing over tasks as though they were data. I'd also like to point out that the brain can't have new computational hardware for every new level of abstraction. And I'd like to suggest that perhaps homoiconic architectures, ones that share computation across levels of abstraction, just like I shared the networks that were used for the basic tasks and metamappings, could be useful more broadly. So if you think about something like mathematics, which is something that has really inspired a lot of my research, there's this shared structure across different levels of mathematical objects, ranging from arithmetic to algebraic objects to categories and so on, that you could potentially benefit a lot by representing those concepts in the same space, even though they occur at different levels of abstraction in some sense. And so I think we should be thinking more about how we can have computational architectures that share computation, the computational tools across levels of abstraction. Right. Sorry, I cut this slide and I didn't make this point, but I'll mention it here. Behaving in accordance with compositional structure doesn't necessarily require representations that you would consider compositional. So I talk about this a bit in the paper, but if you look at the representation plots that I showed you, there's not like a clear compositional structure to how these tasks are represented, but nevertheless, the system can adapt well to transformations of these tasks. And it's sort of hard to define what would be the right compositional structure for adapting to these tasks. In fact, because of the way that the hypernetwork is sort of set up, it might lend itself to different kinds of structures than we might naively think would be useful. And I talk more about that in the paper. And the other thing I'd like to highlight is that by not assuming a particular decomposition for the task space, we might actually allow the system to be more flexible and to adapt to new task relationships that don't correspond to sort of the ones that's seen before. I showed a very limited form of this in the model's ability to adapt to things like new permutations of the variables. But of course, that's quite a simple setting where they kind of do correspond to the decompositions it's already learned. And it would be interesting to see if this model could generalize more broadly. And finally, I'd like to just raise the point that, you know, it's not clear. I don't think we're settled yet on what are the important computational tools for intelligence. And you can do some pretty impressive things with models if you throw enough data at them. Things like GPT-3, which can exhibit some adaptation to task zero shot, even if it's not perfect at it yet. And so it's kind of unclear to me at the moment whether we'll need tools like this or whether data, not just the text data that GPT-3 receives, but the sort of rich embodied experience that humans get over development combined with large scale models would be enough to get flexibility. Cool. With that, I'd like to thank Jay, who was an amazing advisor and collaborator throughout this project and many others. Thank all of you for listening, and There's some links to the paper there if you would like to check it out. And I'd love to take any questions you have now.